Today we're going to talk about two different methods of random sampling. So simple random sampling and systematic random sampling. These are sort of simple random sampling is sort of the foundational type of random sampling that you can do. Almost every sampling technique is based off of it. And so it's good to have a good understanding of it to begin with. It's a fairly simple method. In theory, it works. I think you can argue that in theory it works perfectly. In application, it doesn't work perfectly because there's a lot of sort of administrative type problems that we'll have with it. But if you're looking strictly by the textbook, it works very well. So let's get in here. I like to start most of my presentations with an example of bad math. I find that if you give people an example of good math, if I were to go over someone's research, their life research, people are like, wow, that's really interesting, but really difficult to understand. I think we can all commiserate. We've all made mistakes in our lives. So I like to sort of give examples of bad math so that we can see areas that people have failed in, and not to belittle them, but to sort of learn from their mistakes and to sort of see how these things can happen. Most of my examples are going to be from the United States. They document this stuff a lot better. Their population is 10 times that of Canada, so I guess it's possible to say maybe they make 10 times as many errors. But yeah, so we're going to talk about predicting elections to start. So this is based on last week's material. So the two that I'm going to go over relatively quickly is Dewey was supposed to defeat Truman in 1948. In the history books, you won't find President Dewey mentioned anywhere because he didn't. There's also a famous picture of this with Truman holding up this newspaper where Dewey was supposed to defeat him. And then also back in 1936, this one's a little bit less well known, but well known amongst survey researchers. Landon was supposed to defeat Roosevelt, and that didn't happen. So let's have a look. So in this very first one, the Literary Digest, this was a magazine, they sent out 10 million postcards and they got 2.3 million back. And I've given this presentation, as Tracy mentioned, I've given this presentation many, many times, and it took a few years for it to dawn on me how massive this undertaking was that they sent out 10 million postcards. Think about the surveys that you work on in your countries, and me knowing the relative size of your countries and even the relative size of mine, we never do surveys with 10 million respondents. And in fact, 10 million people sampled, and here they had 2.3 million returned. So it's sort of a naive thing, the way that people think. They think that if I'm having problems with my survey, the way to fix a problematic survey is to throw sample at it. So the more, if I'm worried I'm not going to get good estimates, I just sample more and more people. This is a perfect textbook example of how that doesn't necessarily work. So they had this humongous sample size, but things didn't go well. So what happened is the frame that they used. So recall from last week, the frame is the list that they're using to sample from. So they use telephone books and car registration lists. So back in 1936, these were luxury items, and owning a car is still a luxury item. And so what they did was they accidentally biased themselves towards people who were rich. And in doing so, they accidentally biased themselves towards Republicans, because in the United States, rich people tend to vote Republican, not exclusively, obviously, but they tend to. So what happened is the results from the survey tended to show that Landon was going to win, even though Landon didn't win. Okay, so yeah, there's a problem. So Roosevelt captured 60% of the popular vote, and he won every state except for 2. So it was a landslide for Roosevelt in this election. If we look at this slightly more recently one, it's still more than 70 years old. Dewey was supposed to defeat Truman. And so Gallup polls, which many of us will probably have heard of, if not all of us, they conducted nationwide phone polls in 1948. The problem is that phones were still not in every house. And so this was a problem for them. This is a problem that I think all of our statistical agencies, if we were using telephone surveys, saw in the sort of early 2000s. If you didn't have access to cell phone lists, then, and we worked exclusively from landlines, we started to get a shift in the population where the population we were sampling was getting older. So luckily at Statistics Canada, we have access to both landline phone numbers and cell phone numbers, so it's a little bit easier for us. But back in 1948, this was a big problem still. They stopped 2 weeks before the election. This isn't too big of a deal, but it does allow for changes to happen in the way that the electioneering is happening. So maybe Truman in his last 2 weeks did a lot of great work, and so this may have been an issue. They didn't ask people if they're planning on voting, and this one is one that I like to talk about. So there's something called oh gosh, what's it called? It's the bias. It's the bias that happens when you're trying to please the interviewer. Social desirability bias. So if you ask someone, are you planning on voting in the election? Unless they are adamantly not going to vote and they're not voting for some reason, they will tend to say yes. So same thing, if you ask someone, do you brush your teeth? People will answer yes, whether they brush their teeth or not, because there's this social desirability. They know what the right answer is and they're going to say it. So when you're doing election polls, if you're to ask someone, are you planning on voting? They're going to say yes. So the way they get around this is that they ask demographic questions. So they ask them things like their age, their education, their sex. And from there, they look at voting patterns from previous elections. And what they do is they model it. So I'm a white male in my 40s. I have a university education. So if they ask me if I'm going to vote, I'll say yes, because I typically do. I'll say what party I'm going to vote for. And then their system in behind will then attach a score to it. So let's say that 70% of people in my demographic vote. They would attach a weight of 0.7 to say that I'm contributing 0.7 votes to this. And so if you don't ask people if they're going to vote, or if you don't do some sort of modeling around the voting, then it can be problematic. And the United States has been suffering dearly for this in the past few elections. So both Obama and Trump have motivated subpopulations in the United States that don't typically vote very frequently, and they've been increasing their the people showing up for voting, and so that's what's been causing problems for pollsters in the United States. So that's another problem they had. They allowed interviewers to use opportunity sampling. So opportunity sampling, I talked very quickly about this last week. Opportunity sampling is the idea that the interviewers can select who they're going to interview. So this is a little bit problematic. It means they can call their friends. You may not call your friends during an election poll because they may not want to answer you because they know you. But these are the kind of things that can happen. Okay, so what happened? So Literary Digest, this was a big magazine in the United States. They went out of business. Gallup lost a lot of business as well. Opinion polls are much better designed. And luckily for Statistics Canada and for Statistics Your Country, a lot of research went into polling and how surveys are conducted. And so we've all sort of benefited from this. I hope, well, I shouldn't say I hope. I don't think there are many election official statistical bureaus that do election polling, but there's still a lot of the stuff that went into these projects that we've been able to learn from. And nationwide polling in the States, they now only need to do something in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 4,000 interviews to get the results that they need. Now, that's unstratified. I talked last week about stratification, which is dividing our geographies up into smaller regions. If they want to know state by state what the results are going to be, obviously the sample size is going to be much bigger. But if they just want a general idea of what's going to happen, then they can. It works that way. All right, so let's get into this. The first thing I want to talk about before we get actually into the presentation are these things called random number tables. And so this is an example of a random number table that was in a book called, I can't remember the name of it, but this was published in the 1950s. It's page after page after page of random numbers like this. It was put out by the Rand Corporation, which is a think tank in the United States. There's interesting book reviews of this on Amazon, but yeah, so pages and pages of random numbers. And what this was used for was before desktop and laptop computers were widespread, a lot of people would use this for sampling. And it's not uncommon to use paper random number tables to do sampling. We've done this at Statistics Canada up until very recently. One of the benefits of using a random number table is that if you ask someone to draw a sample of random numbers, they can then show you exactly on the page how they came up with those numbers. So it's impossible for them to cheat the system when you can go and say, show me how you got the random numbers that you would use. And what people that use this as Statistics Canada would do is, as they used a number, they would just scratch it out. So for example, if they were to use the first digit up there, we see on row 00 in column 50, there's the digit 5. Maybe if once they use that number, they would just cross it out. So this is how we would use random number tables in the past. Now, how do we use this? So first we have to determine the starting point. So we have to determine where we're going to start in the row and column. Again, people at Statistics Canada, they would always just start where they had left off and scratched out a number. You need to know the number of digits that you need. So for example, if I need a random number between 1, I think I'm going to give an example in a minute, 1 and 75, we need a 2-digit number. If we use a 1-digit number, we're only going to be able to select numbers between 1 and 9. And if we use a 3-digit number, we'll be selecting numbers between 1 and 999. So we'll have way too many numbers. We'll be picking all sorts of numbers that we'll never use. So we need to have an idea of how many digits we need to have. We need to determine the path that we're going to use. So are we going to go down the column or across the row? I find for my eyes, especially, it's much easier to go down the column than across the row. So that's what we do. And then sampling with or without replacement. This has less to do with the random number table and more to do with the sampling technique you're using. But we also have to figure out, if I hit the same number that I've already used, do I get to use it again? Yes or no? So let's take a look at this. So if we start at row 00 and column 50, so right up in the top left-hand corner, and we're going to go downwards, what are the first 3 numbers between 1 and 75? So the first number that we see here is 59. We then see that we have 99, which will be excluded. It should be in red. I've messed up that slide. So 59 we take, 99 we reject, 10 we accept, 86 we reject, and 11 we take. So if I needed 3 numbers between 1 and 75 going down that column, I would take the numbers 59, 10, and 11. And then I would just cross them all out, and I would start it. The next place I would start would be column 50 and row 5. So that's how random number tables are used. A slightly trickier example here, if I start all the way at the bottom down at row 48 and column 61, and again, we're going to go down, then what are the first 3 numbers between 1 and 999? So it's a little tricky on the eyes. But if we go down to the second last row, which is 48, and then we go over 12-ish spots, we get over to row 61, we'll see that the first number there is 538. The second number is 337. And then we go all the way back up to the top, and we start in the next column available, which is column 64. And we find that the number there is 882. So that's how to use random number tables. I'm going to give an example of this in the presentation where I use this, so I just wanted to go over this with people to show how it works. All right, so let's get into the meat of this presentation. So simple random sampling and systematic sampling. So I don't know how many of your countries use the GSBPM. I know a lot of them do. So the presentation, the material for this presentation is going to fall under 2.4, which is designing the frame and sample methodology. And then also in 4.1, which is selecting the samples. So if you're used to the GSBPM, you'll sort of recognize this. And if you haven't seen the GSBPM before, this is just a structure way to show what parts of the survey you're at certain times. So these are the 2 that I'm working with right now. And just a simple recall from last week. We saw this a little bit in my examples of bad math. When we're talking about our sample design, there's 6 things that we want to remember. So we need to worry about our population. So who is it that we're trying to sample? The frame, how is it that we're going to be able to select them? What the survey units are, right? So I talked about in our labor force survey that when we're sampling, it's the dwelling. It's a house that we're going to sample, but we want to know about the people inside the house and certain characteristics about them. So we have all sorts of different ways to define our survey units. Sample size I talked briefly about. Sample allocation had to do with stratification, and the sample selection method, we saw some of those. And again, simple random sample and systematic random sample, which we're going to see, are 2 examples of these. And everything we do when we're designing, everything goes to put towards the emphasis on what is it that we're going to try to estimate, what are our estimation procedures, and what is the precision of our answer, and how important is that? And again, this is a recall from last week. So for probability sampling, every unit in our population should have a positive probability of being included in that sample, and we have to be able to calculate the probability. So What this is saying is we don't want someone to have a zero chance of being selected. They have a positive probability. And in calculating, it means we know the population that they're being drawn from. For some sampling techniques and in some situations, we won't be able to do this. But for the most part, if we're using a frame, we should be able to. And then we draw the sample by some random method. All right, simple random sampling. Let's get into it. Simple random sampling, or SRS, is a basic probability selection scheme in which a predetermined number of units is selected from a population list so that each unit has an equal chance of being included in our sampling. And the way that I explain this to people is it's the same as putting everyone's name into a hat. So I throw everyone's name into a hat and I draw them one at a time. And this is simple random sampling. It's a very, very easy technique. It's easy to understand. I think even school children, if you say that, there's some prize that's going to be drawn and everyone puts their name in a hat and you draw one of those names, the students shouldn't complain that it's unfair before the selection is taking place. There's no bias in this, or it's very hard to introduce bias into simple random sampling. Now, simple random sampling, we have to have the frame. If I'm going to draw the names out of a hat, I have to have the names to put into a hat. If I don't have a frame, I can't do simple random sampling. Now, a note on notation, when we use capital letters or uppercase letters, we're talking about population. When we use lowercase letters, we're talking about the samples. So in this last little bullet we see here, that because it's an equal probability, the probability of any unit being selected is lowercase n divided by capital N or uppercase N. And we often just say it's n over n, which confuses a lot of people because they think they can just cancel that out. But if we're doing, for example, if we're drawing 10 people out of 100, let's make my life easy. So the lowercase n would be the sample size, which is 10. We divide that by 100, which is the population. And everyone has a 1 in 10 or 10% chance of being selected. So that's the way we use this notation. Now, a consideration we have to do is, are we going to use simple random sampling, or we do it with replacement or without replacement? And from the last little bit here, we see that they're practically identical if the sample size is a very small fraction of the population. So if I'm drawing a sample of population of Canada, which is 36 million, and let's say I'm drawing a population of a sample of 100 people from that population, the chance of me repeatedly picking the same person is incredibly small, so I wouldn't necessarily worry about it. But if I was drawing names out of a hat, for example, people listening to this presentation, I'd have to be more considerate of, are we going to allow to have people drawn more than once or not? So with replacement, without replacement. There are not a lot of sampling techniques that I know that include replacement. Certainly, if you do use a method like that, you tend not to ask the question. You would never ask the questionnaire twice to the person. You would just double their weight, perhaps. So there are some methods that use this, but they are uncommon. All right, what's the procedure for drawing a simple random sample? So we just sequentially number the elements in the frame from 1 to n, and then n units are selected one at a time using some randomized process, such as a random number table or generated by computers. So in the day and age of computing power, it's very easy to do this. You can do it in Excel. You can add random numbers beside the list in your frame, and you can set it up in such a way that it can randomly select for you. But the example I'm going to use is obviously using random number tables to give this example. This is what it looks like. We have a national lottery in Canada, which is called Lotto 649. So they randomly draw 6 numbers out of a hat. I guess it's all done by computers nowadays. They used to have big ball machines where you can watch the balls come out. But so they draw 6 out of the 49. And so you can see from there whether or not something has been selected. For a lot of my presentations, I'm going to use this example where we have this population of 6 farms. So we have a population of 6 farms. They have various expenditures. You can see from this, they range from, at the low end, farm number 6 is $12,500. And at the high end, farm number 2 is $470,000. So this population, I consider this sort of a mix of 2 different populations. The smaller farms at $12,500 could be considered a small family farm, maybe, where they're just farming to sell at local farmer markets. Whereas you get up to the $470,000 one, This is much more of an industrial farm. It's much bigger. They might be selling their produce to be canned or something like that. But we can see that the populations here, they're all farms, but the properties or characteristics about these farms are quite different. So if we decide we're going to draw a random sample, here's taking a random sample of our population. So 2 amongst 6. So if we randomly selected, we want to take the means, the average of our farm expenditures. If we randomly select our 2 smallest farms, which is 1 and 6, we see that the mean expenditure here is 19,250. And if we select our 2 biggest farms, which is 2 and 5, and we take the average, then we see that the average of these 2 is 350,000. So we're selecting a third of our population. We're selecting 2 amongst 6, and the estimates we're getting for the average farm expenditure is vastly different. If we extend this to 3, so we'll select 3 out of our 6 farms, we still see that if we pick the 3 smallest farms, the average is 34,100. And if we select the 3 biggest farms, then it's 281,667. So we're now selecting half of our population, and we're getting vastly different estimates for what the totals could be. Again, selecting 4 out of 6 farms, it's still a factor of 4 to 1 from the looks of this, 61,000 versus 227,000 at the high end. Even when we select 5 out of our 6 farms, so we select 84% of our population. If we select the 5 smallest farms, we get 95,460. And if we select the 5 biggest farms, we get 186,000. So just by removing 1 farm, because the smallest farm is so small and the biggest farm is so big, if we draw a sample that excludes one or the other, we get these vastly different estimates for what our mean farm expenditure is. So this is an example where we can see that simple random sampling, despite giving an unbiased estimate of what our average is going to be. So we didn't accidentally favor large farms or accidentally favor smaller farms. We drew the numbers out of a hat. We get these vastly different estimates. And if we went to a client and said, you want us to do a survey for you based on whatever characteristic you're looking for, we're going to sample 84% of the population, and the estimates are going to vary by this much that you see on the screen. They're going to say, why have you come to us with this proposal? It's preposterous. We're not going to get a good estimate if you do it this way. So simple random sample, it's a great way to select unbiased, but when there's a lot of different characteristics in the population, sometimes it's not the right way to go. Don't worry, in future presentations, I'm going to show you how to get around this problem. In fact, I think it's the next presentation. So we take a look here. I just sort of graphed this on a plot here. And if we sample farms of size 1, we have this sort of a huge range of values. And then it converges if we do obviously if we do a census and we take all 6 farms, we get the true value, which is slightly above $150,000. I think it was $159,000. Okay. So I got a question here. So can the terms survey units and units of analysis be used interchangeably? No, those are 2 different things. So survey units is used generally. Survey units sort of encompass all different units. So a survey unit, and I apologize if I've been using them interchangeably, it's been lazy. Survey unit, a unit of analysis is what you're going to do the analysis on. So for example, a sampled unit could be a household, but the unit of analysis might be the people inside of it. So if you look at the presentation from last week, there's a bit more on that. So there's definitely different units that are being used. Okay, so what are the advantages of simple random sampling? It literally in the title says simple. It's a simple technique to use. It's not difficult at all. It requires no additional information on the frame in order to draw the sample. So we don't need to know what kind of farm it is. We don't need to know any other kind of information about it except that this farm exists. And estimation is simple. Because everything has an equal chance of being selected, it means that all of the weights are going to be equal. We're going to see this in a future presentation. But it basically means that we don't have to take into consideration how the sample was taken. We can just say, okay, we've selected 1, 2, 3, 5 units, and we'll just take the average of those. Our disadvantages, it's going to require a frame. For our first few sampling methods we're going to see, you're always going to need a frame. It can be very expensive to carry out face-to-face interviews. I'm going to show an example of this in a second. It doesn't make use of auxiliary information. So above, we said one of the advantages of is that you don't need any additional information. And down on the disadvantages, we're going to say that we don't use the auxiliary information. So we saw, because we looked at the population of these types of farms, we saw there's some very big ones, very small ones. If we had that on the frame somehow, like we knew what they were farming, or we maybe knew, what their expenditures were last year, then we could do it we can use that information to draw a sample. It's possible to draw a sample that poorly represents our population. The bigger the sample size, the less likely that is to be true, but still in my example, I showed that we can have problems with it. So this is Saskatchewan is a province in Canada. So you'll see it there tucked in between Alberta and Manitoba. And just to give people some scale here, the province of Saskatchewan is 1,200 kilometers long by 600 kilometers wide. So it's quite big. And I use this example to show why it's expensive to carry out face-to-face interviews. And this, you can sort of scale this to your country. If I told an interviewer, or I told someone who was in charge of interviewers, if I said, look, I need to do 10 face-to-face interviews in Saskatchewan, the interview will take about an hour. Please go and do it. They're going to say, Gavin, you don't understand how interviewing works, because, for example, that interview in the upper right-hand corner of Saskatchewan, that one will probably, I guarantee that would be a fly-in community, and you would have to fly there to interview the one person that you're sampled. So when we're talking about face-to-face interviews, the administration of the survey, the administration of the collection of the data falls apart right away. I can't just say to an interviewer, please go and select 10 people from your province and do the interviewing. It doesn't work. So it's virtually impossible. But now that we have Zoom and Teams and all the other things, it is virtually possible. So if I said you had to do face-to-face interviewing and we were going to do it this way, to me, doing virtual face-to-face is the same as a telephone interview. So if this is a telephone interview, then simple random sampling goes back to being very easy. Face-to-face interviewing, it doesn't work quite so well. We could do it so that we have clustering to do sampling, but we're going to see that again in a future presentation. It's going to help to reduce this problem of Saskatchewan being so large. All right, so this should be an example, not an exercise. I'm going to show you how this works. So we're going to use our random number table on the next slide, and we're going to select 10 farms. And so the thing we have to consider is the starting point, the number of digits, the path, and with or without replacement. And so because I'm doing I want to calculate the mean of the farm expenditures for 10 farms. So the first thing I know is that I need to select 2 digits. I have 100 farms, and 100 farms, I can use 2 digits because if I try to select the 100th farm, if I come across the number 00, I can say that represents 100. And I'm going to start at row 00, column 55, and I'm going to go downwards. So this is what it looks like. Hopefully everyone can see it. The type of farm is irrelevant for simple random sampling. It's just there for my example. So we have 100 farms. We can see actually that this is my frame. My frame is sorted by expenses. So we see that we have that. Now, if we had all this data, obviously we wouldn't be doing simple random sampling. Maybe we're doing simple random sampling to audit the value, to make sure that these numbers they provided are actually correct. So we're going to go visit them. So if I select my first farm, if we look at my random number table on the right, the first farm, I'm starting at row 00 in column 55. The first farm I'm going to select is farm number 58. And so I select this farm. It's a cattle farm. Its expenditures were 18,500. If it's an audit and I'm looking at their receipts, I'd say, okay, yeah, it's 18,500. We move on. The next one selected is going to be 76. And we do this 10 times, 97, 19, 24, 88, 47, 62, 63, and 56. Is that 10? Oh, yeah. So there's our 10 farms. We take a look at their average expenses, then we take an average of that. Because they all have the same chance of being selected, we don't have to take in the probability of selection. We can just take a simple average. And our average gives us the average expenses for these farms is 25,800. The reason that it's sort of critically important that we randomly select is because it reinforces the idea that we're unbiased, that we're not selecting farms or whatever the population is we're selecting. We're not adding some sort of personal bias into the way that we're selecting, some sort of preconceived notion. So a concern I have, let's say, a sampling technique that we could talk about is opportunity sampling. I talked about that in the example of the Gallup poll. So opportunity sampling is you go out and you ask whoever you like. Now, suppose you had a survey, you were asking people, in a downtown core of your capital city, what it is that they would like to do, some infrastructure questions. Should we invest more in city parks or should we invest more in something else? And you send me down there with a clipboard to get people to fill this in. I'm going to feel much more comfortable. And let's say I've had I've talked to families. I see people walking with their children, people with children that, they might like parks more. They might, if the kids aren't being too fussy, they might have a couple minutes to spare. And so I've had a little bit of luck talking to families. I approach them and say, okay, I'm doing a survey to figure out what people would like us to do with the downtown core. And then I sort of introduce it and I say, that we can pick parks and stuff. And then they might be more interested in doing it, where perhaps if I see people that, if this is in the evening and back pre-pandemic, and if I see people that may be out on a romantic date, perhaps I don't want to interrupt them. And the usage for the downtown core may be very different from families than from these couples. And if I accidentally start saying, okay, well, or in my head, I start saying, I'll have a lot more opportunity. I'm doing a lot better when I talk to families, and I start only asking families, all of a sudden, all of my answers are going to reflect what families want to do at the downtown, as opposed to what people without children may want to do. So it's important to allow some sort of randomness into the way we select so that the interviewer, in this case me, doesn't accidentally introduce some bias in the way that they're selecting their population. Okay, let's talk briefly about systematic sampling. So systematic sampling, it's just selecting in turn every kth unit from a frame starting at a random point. So this just systematically goes through our list. So before we randomly went through it, now what we're going to do is we're going to select at random some start and jump through it. So let's take a look at how this works. Again, we have to have a frame. If we don't have a frame, we can't do this. And again, we're going to have an equal probability of selection. So the selection here, the probability of being selected is 1 divided by k, where k is our skip. So for example, if we're doing a sample where we're selecting every 20th phone number in a phone book, if we're going every 20th one, the probability of any phone number being selected is 1 in 20. So that's how this works. Now, the procedure to select a systematic random sample. The funny thing is, simple random sampling and systematic random sampling have exactly the same acronym. Because simple random sampling is more important, we call that one SRS, and systematic sampling, unfortunately, gets the acronym sometimes SysRS or systematic RS to avoid the confusion. So if we're selecting n units, we first have to determine a sampling interval and then some random starting point. So again, we want to sequentially number all of our elements from 1 to n. We calculate our skip patterns. So K, which is our skip, is just the population, capital N, uppercase N, divided by N, which is our sample, which is our lowercase n. And then we choose a random start, which is a random integer anywhere between 1 and n. And then we choose our units. And if necessary, so suppose we're selecting out of 100 farms and we choose one higher up, like randomly select farm number 90 as our starting point, we would then skip back to the start of the list to make sure we got through the entire list. So here's an example of 749. So they selected 7 farms amongst 49. They randomly selected at farm number 3, well, whatever units these are. They selected number 3. They skipped ahead 7 each time. So they select unit 3, 10, 17, 24, et cetera, until they got through the entire list. And what systematic sampling does is it disperses our sample through this entire population. And we'll talk about that a bit in a second. So what exactly is this K? So K is simply the skip that we're going to use in our samples. So we often talk about doing a 1 in K sample. So a 1 in 20 or a 1 in 30, 1 in 100. It's just talking about what percentage of our population we're going to take. And so that's how we skip through this list. And since our list, we have ordinal numbers. So we label things 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We don't have decimals, so we just skip through that way. Again, looking at our farm example, we only have 6 farms, so this one's going to be quite easy to draw a systematic sample from. So if we draw 2, our starting points, our K is going to be 6 divided by 2, which is 3, which we see. And we can pick any random star 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we start at the number 1, so our first one here, if we start at the number 1, then we add 3, we get 4. So we've selected our 2 farms. If we select farm number 2, we add 3, we get 5. If we randomly select our start as 3, next one becomes 6. If we randomly select 4, we count up 3, so it goes 4, we have it, then we add 3, 5, 6, 1. So it gives us the same sample, 1 and 4. If we count up 3 from farm number 5, we would count 6, 1, 2. So that's how we select that. And so this is why if we're selecting 2, there's only 3 different samples we can get. And if we're selecting 3, there's 2 different samples we can get, 1, 3, 5, or 2, 4, 6. Now, what's important to see here is that every farm appears. So farms 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in both of these schemes, they appear, and they appear exactly the same number of times. In this case, they appear 1 time each. If I had written this 1, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6, 4, 1, 5, 2, 6, 3, they appear exactly twice each. But the important thing is they appear the same number of times and they all appear. This shows that they all have exactly the same chance of being selected using systematic random sampling. Okay, what are the advantages here? It's easier than simple random sampling. With simple random sampling, we had to go back and forth between our random number table, whether it be inside the computer using Excel or something like that, or our actual piece of paper for our random number table. It disperses our sample more evenly over the population. So I talked about this. So whatever order our sample is in, whatever order our frame is in, this is what our population is going to be skipping through. It's still easy to estimate the characteristics of the population because the sampling, everything still has an equal weight because everything still has an equal chance of selection. Our difficulty or our disadvantages here, you still need a frame. This hasn't become frame independent. It's going to at some point. It's still very expensive to carry out face-to-face interviews. We haven't fixed the problem. And in a lot of cases, we'll actually make the problem worse using this. And this one I enjoy. Periodicity in the frame may result in a sample that poorly represents the population. How do I want to approach this in a Zoom meeting? Does anyone want to try to tackle this? They can send it to me or they can send it to the chat in general. What does anyone want to hazard a guess at what I mean by periodicity in the frame? Maybe answer to the Ask Gavin questions one so I can see it on my screen. But does anybody want to try to hazard a guess or knows what the answer is here? To periodicity in the frame may result in a sample that poorly represents the population. When might we have a frame in some sort of order where there's periodicity? So periodicity in the frame means that, let's say we're doing this in order of time. So every month we have a registration. So good. Thank you. I got one person that said seasonality is an issue. So types of crops as an example. So that's perfect. Let's change the example to seasonality. Let's say you live somewhere where there's 4 different seasons. And so every season a different crop is harvested. If you skip through in something that is a multiple of 4 or a proper fraction, I think, of 4, then you'll run into a problem. So for example, let's say I can't even fathom what they might be. Let's say corn, wheat, apples, and rice. Corn, wheat, apples, rice. If you do every 4th one and you start at 4, you're going to select rice every single time. And if you have a random number, if you have a K that's 2, you'll select, I think I said corn and rice. So it'd be corn, rice, corn, rice, corn, rice. You would never end up getting wheat or apples as in this example. So periodicity is going to be problematic because your skip rate is hitting on some pattern. Another one could be daily sales of some good in stores. If your multiple is 7, you might pick up every Friday, you might pick up every Tuesday, which is going to show some sort of periodicity in the data. So that can be very problematic. You have to understand your frames when you're doing especially systematic sampling. In the example I showed for the farms in the previous one, I noted right away that they were ordered in by expenditures. So that's an important thing to see. Okay, I'm quickly going to do now a systematic sample to show you here how this works. So we got to calculate the K. So we have 100 farms, and we're going to select 10. And I've already given myself a random start, so we don't have to figure out where it's coming from. So our K is going to be our N over N, so our population over our sample. We have 100 farms. We saw this already. And we're going to select 10 farms. So our K is 10. So we're going to select every 10th farm. We could have started anywhere. We would our random start should be a number randomly selected from 1 to 100, however it is that you select your random number, and then we'll skip through from there. So in this case, I ended up my random start being 8. So I'm going to pick the 8th farm, the 18th farm, the 28th farm, 38, 48, 58, 68, 78, 88, 98. So that's how I pick my 10 farms. And you'll see this is much quicker and easier than the simple random sampling was. I didn't have to keep going back to my random number table to figure out which I was selecting. I was systematically jumping through it. I gave myself a K of 10, which is easy for me, and that's why I can do it. But K could be anything. K could be a fractional number, in which case you would just round to find which one you're going to use. Yeah, and so again, we take a look at what their expenditures are, and then we take the average, and in this case, we had 25,150. There's one thing I want to discuss. Well, I'm going to leave it on the question slide. There's one thing I want to discuss here before I end, and maybe a couple of points. One is understanding where your frame comes from is critically important. So at Statistics Canada, we have several humongously large frames, which I spoke about last week, such as our business register, which is all businesses operating in Canada. We have the address register, which is all addresses in Canada, or all privately or collectively occupied dwellings in Canada. And we have these large frames. And so it's very easy for us to use these things. You have to be careful when you're using your frame, not only that you know its source, but how it's created and how things end up on it. So it could be that one example I have is where we try to do this match. We also have a telephone file. We try to do a match between our telephone file and our address register. And if there's a match, it goes into this file I create. If there isn't a match, then I look only at the telephone file. But what that does in the way that I create it is that the first part of my file is perfect matches, address and telephone number, and the tail end of my frame is just phone numbers and with no addresses matched to it. So the results that I get from from the bottom part of my frame is a lot worse than what I get from the top. And because it's created that way, I have to remember that, oh yeah, there's two different ways this frame's created. The top part's going to be very good and the bottom part's going to be very bad. And so one thing I might do is I might just sort on some other variable. And again, I could randomly sort it to get rid of any sort of periodicity or any sort of effect of the way this list was created. And we can do that for the seasonal stuff. So for example, if I have a frame where it's listed in order of the months or the quarters that it came in, I can just take that frame, save another copy of it, and sort it by a random number to remove that. And that way I can skip through. There are times when it's important to skip through in order. And so, for example, in Canada, we have postal codes. In the United States, they have zip codes. I'm not sure what everyone calls it where they are. But for postal codes, this gives us neighborhoods. We have 6-digit postal codes in Canada. The first 3 digits are a mix of numbers and letters. These give us neighborhoods. And so if I take a list, so for example, the city of Ottawa with about 1 million inhabitants, if I take the list of all of the dwellings that I can find in Ottawa and I sort it by postal code, by systematically skipping through postal codes, it means I'm relatively guaranteed to get, some neighborhoods, some dwellings from each neighborhood. So by sorting by postal code, I've sorted by geography, and I've made sure by using systematic sampling that I'm skipping through it. So that's a very good time to be using systematic sampling. It guarantees that we're getting people from every community. And it's actually something that's called implicit stratification. So by sorting by postal code and skipping through in that order, I'm implicitly drawing the correct proportion from each of these neighborhoods. And I'd be happy to go in a bit more detail on that if people want me to talk about that. The other thing is, again, focusing on frames, the joke that I like to leave my students with is knowing that you need to draw a sample and being given a frame is like knowing that you're not feeling well, walking down the street, seeing a pill on the ground, and saying, I'm not feeling well. There's a pill on the ground. I need to take a pill because I'm sick, picking up that pill and taking it. It's equally as dangerous to say, I need your raw sample. I've got this frame that I don't know where it came from. I'm going to draw from this frame. So I guess I'll leave you with that. It's sort of a funny example. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask it in the chat. Again, if you need to contact anyone from Prask, you can contact them this way. And I'll end my presentation there.